This week on ANN Television, we have the English Hour, and this time we're going to have one of the new format programs. We're going to talk about Syria, we're going to talk about the British elections, and we're going to talk about tolerance. So welcome back again to the English Hour on ANN Satellite Television, and again we have this slightly different format where just you and I discussing issues, and the issues we shall discuss are Syria, and we will discuss the UK elections, and we will discuss the whole issue of tolerance in society today. But let's start with Syria. An issue precious to you and precious to me. Syria is in crisis. Most particularly, the children of Syria face a crisis. In 2011, Syria had over 20,000 schools. 97% of the schools in Syria were free. Today, children are scared. The recovery of a lost generation of education may be achievable. We are producing a generation without a future, leading to unemployment, prostitution, and child labor. 3,500 schools have been destroyed in Syria, and 5,000 schools are unusable, having been converted into shelters, and sometimes, in rebel-held areas, converted into prisons. 63% of Syrian school children are out of school in Syria. The war in Syria is the result of an East-West conflict, and the international community must live up to its responsibility. We need a new emergency plan to build schools both inside Syria and in host countries for Syrian refugees. We have a duty to the children of Syria. So, Syria remains the most important, the primal conflict in the world today. Why? Because the great powers are engaged in Syria. It is the melting pot for the world. It is the spot on which the crisis between Sunni Islam and Shiite Islam is coming together. It's a civil war. It's a major conflict, and hopefully it's calming down a little. There is the prospect of stability in Syria. At least we dream that there is the prospect of stability in Syria. At what a cost after these years of war. I was talking, I did return to Syria, as some of you may know, not that long ago, and I talked to a few Syrians about the situation. I was listening to a particular talk by Dr. Sami Obaid, one of the more influential Syrians, and he was saying that the minorities remain an integral part of the Syrian mosaic, and I think that is essentially so. And many from the Syrian minorities remain, there's still 70 Jews in Damascus, or something of that order. So the minorities are vital. And we need to see this spirit of inclusivity that includes the minorities, that encourages a sense of one Syria persist. It's kind of that Sufi ideology based on love based on inclusivity rather than exclusivity. And I think the Sufi ideology, which is basically Islamic, is one that does and can pervade all religions if given a chance, because it's fundamentally sound, that concept of listening to God, of treating the other with respect and respecting all. So we need tolerance, and Samuel Bay, when I was listening to him, was saying we can build on that kind of legacy, and Sufi thought is a particularly strong strand amongst the people of Damascus, and I think we need to hold close to that. And if we hold close to that ideology, then the kind of Syria we all admire can persist and can be reborn. I was listening to another gentleman, Hussein Maklouf. He's a minister for humanitarian aid in Syria. And he was also talking about the minorities and saying the Kurds have the same rights as other Syrian citizens. And of course they do. I mean, they have confronted, they have fought. The Kurds have been in the lead in fighting groups like Jabhat al-Nusra, and they need to be respected and given the same rights as other Syrian citizens. That was not always the case. That was certainly not always the case. They deserved their right to autonomy as regards their language in the schools and so on, and I don't think anybody will ever try and take that back from them. But Syria has to, in my view, remain one Syria. The idea of breaking Syria into little component parts is not appropriate. This, despite the fact that this is a civil war. You do get this mentality that this is a war on Syria. Okay, well, we can say it's a war on Syria because there are so many great powers intervening, but ultimately there are Syrians fighting Syrians in this war, and we have to be acutely conscious of that. We also need to be conscious of the role of the media, the international media. I was listening to a guy called Danny Markey who was saying this is the first globalized conflict. There isn't much balanced reporting. And Danny was saying the first victim of war is truth. There is no doubt that the Syrian government should have done more to allow better access to journalists throughout this war. It's very unfortunate that this has not been the case, but it is changing. Why should it have been the case all along? Because if you fail to allow journalists in, they will still write. You can't suppress the press. So, you have to take the rough with the smooth. And this idea, this concept of keeping them out is utterly pathetic and counterproductive. So it's just no good, because then you just get biased reporting and more biased reporting and more biased reporting. You may think the reporting is biased if you let them in, but my goodness, how much worse it is if you keep people from the truth and keep them out. So freedom of access for journalists is essential, whatever or however much you may or may not like what they're saying. So the Syrian government has made gross errors in this respect, but and journalists must be allowed access to the views of independent Syrians who do not reflect the government's viewpoint. It is important to constructively engage with journalists and allow them to analyze events. And if more people listen, then there is more chance, more prospect for peace. There was another man in Syria when I was in Syria. He's not Syrian, but an interesting guy, analyst Barrett Greenapple, and he was saying the media will report a story whether you allow them access or not, and that's precisely the point. If the media isn't let in, people will think you are hiding something. The media began by calling the conflict in Syria a revolution. Now they call it a civil war. whatever you think about the media, even countries like North Korea, one of the most repressive countries on the face of the earth, even countries like North Korea let journalists in. Engagement and dialogue produces better understanding. So, I was listening to one Syrian, I won't name him, who was saying, Syrians don't need to be preached at as to how to reconcile with one another. That's what he told me. He's wrong. Everybody needs to be preached at as to how to reconcile with one another. There is an absolutely vital need for this kind of approach. The Minister for Reconciliation is very good in Syria. And we need to encourage reconciliation. There need to be every dimension of reconciliation needs to be explored, even right down to a Truth and Reconciliation Committee of the kind that was used in South Africa. Wounds from war are terrible, but wounds from civil war, from this civil war, can be healed if we give it time, and we need to start now. And I think this is so essential, so vital. If we start reconciliation, then maybe some. The trouble with civil wars is the atrocious levels of violence, and the media, of course, reports about the failings of the government, but the failings are on all sides. I mean, the Fawaz Akras was talking to me about the so-called cannons from hell that used to be fired by the opposition in Aleppo. The cylinders filled with nails and pressurized with gas, and you can see videos of them making these things on YouTube. So there is brutality on all sides in a civil war, seminally flagged up by the failure of people on all sides to take prisoners. This is changing, I hope, but there was a time when everybody was executing their prisoners. Civil wars are brutal. The brutality of civil wars is seminal, whether they're in Libya or Syria or wherever. We had a civil war years ago. Of course, it's generations and generations ago, but we lost in Britain. We had a terrible civil war. We lost a third of the population, one way or another, or certainly a third of the male population. Now we see the cruelty and the cost of war. And hopefully Syria is walking now towards peace. I was impressed by Walid Muallim, who was and is, I hope, a friend of mine, and I met him, and he was talking about the need for stability. He talked about the way forward. The Syrian president, he was saying, was elected in 2014 for 7 years. And Walid was saying 80% of the Syrian people, or the Syrian people who went to vote, voted for him. Well, okay. That does not mean that we do not need some form of peace settlement for Syria. There has to be a peace settlement. The idea of being touted by the Western powers again and again is the idea of power sharing. I don't know how effective that is. The concept is that you have a government that is part run by opposition and part run by the Syrian establishment, so that you have ministers from both. Maybe, and then you have some internationally supervised elections. maybe that's the way forward. What is essential is effective peace talks and some effective decision making. Because otherwise, who's going to buy into this peace? You'll have people going on fighting for nothing, just to fight. So we need the symbolism of some effective peace negotiations that actually go somewhere. I would like to see far more second-track conferences for peace. We don't see enough of them. We need them. There is no reason why they don't take place. There is no reason why they don't take place in Damascus and that they don't happen more effectively. We're on the road to peace in Syria. We're on the road to an end to this terrible time of war. We must all support a new tomorrow and a new Syria, Syria built on inclusivity and cooperation and indeed on forgiveness. Thank you. And now we move on to our second subject, and it's completely, well, we're off at a tangent. We're going to talk about the British elections. Britain has two major political parties, the Conservative Party, otherwise known as the Tories, on the right, and the Labour Party, otherwise known as the Socialists, on the left. The Tory party is led by a strong-arm leader, Mrs. Theresa May, the current Premier of Britain. The Labour Party is led by an ideologue of the left, the socialist Jeremy Corbyn. And now these two political giants face one another in a general election, an election Theresa May will win. Okay, well now we are going to talk about Britain's elections and what a business that is. You know the situation. Theresa May, the British Prime Minister, has called elections because she, thinks that she can get greater power because she will get more members of Parliament and a longer term in office, and B, because this greater power will enable her to deal ruthlessly with the questions of the day, like Britain leaving the European Union and like the Scottish problem, which is a minor but irritating issue for British politics. So Theresa May has called an election, and against her is the great Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the left. An interesting man he is. You have Theresa May on the one side, the new Maggie Thatcher. Jeremy Corbyn, it's the first time we've had a truly committed socialist in leadership on the left in Britain for years. And he's an ideologue. He compromises on some things, but his essential belief is that, he's a man who believes in non-violence, believes in pacifism. He voted against every major military intervention internationally, whether it was the war in Iraq or anything. Anything involving British troops overseas, he has voted against consistently. I mean, he wouldn't call himself a pacifist, but I guess he is. Well, Gandhi wouldn't have called himself a pacifist. He called himself a believer in non-violence, and I think that is the Corbyn approach. He has compromised as much as he can. He has said that he will not oppose this. Britain has this ridiculous level of spending on the Trident missile system, which takes up a vast proportion of our defense budget, on a completely unusable nuclear system of warheads that who are you going to kill with them? I mean, it is bizarre and pointless. But there you go. It's an obsession. It's based on pride, and it is a waste of money beyond comprehension. But nonetheless, Britain wastes money on a vast nuclear armament. So be it. But Corbyn is an old-style socialist. He wants to take back the industry into public ownership. For instance, the railways he has announced he will re-nationalise. Many of the British people will be grateful. We've seen a completely farcical level of incompetence in running our railways since they were privatised. And it's interesting that many things are privatised by ideologues of the right who really don't know what they are doing. We saw that in Britain with the postal service. I mean, a ridiculous thing to privatise. In every country of the world, the post office is state-run, and we privatised it. So we've made errors, and in terms of the ideology of the right, and we've of course made errors in terms of the ideology of the left. But we haven't for years seen a true political divide, a true choice in Britain between the right and the left. It's quite refreshing to see, actually, because you have the kind of internationalist, one-world man, Jeremy Corbyn, against the hyper-nationalist, right-wing, Britain First, Theresa May. We do have other parties. They're necessary. They're not so much of a major force now. The Liberal Party was our centre party, believing in freedom and freedom of expression, freedom of the basic human right to freedom. It was free trade, free everything. It's a kind of globalization, liberal, free-thinking party in the centre. And it lost its way. Hopefully it will manage to survive the forthcoming battle between the right and the left and not be completely obliterated, because we do need a centre party in Britain. We do need a moderate voice in the middle. And I would like to see that. In terms of the other, we also have, of course, other minority parties that are on the rise. In Britain, the Green Party, which is an environmental party, is very much resurgent, and it's good to see that it's so, although it only has one member of parliament at present. But I think that will become a greater force as more young people come of age, because young people, the next generation, have a compassionate care for the environment, and we should all do that. We do not inherit the earth, we borrow it from the next generation. So we need to have a greater compassion for the environment and for the world we live in. That applies whether we are living in the Middle East or living in America or Britain or wherever. It's one world, and if we destroy it, I think there are two ways we may destroy the world we live in. One is through war, and one is through environmental mismanagement. And I think few people would argue with that. And so there's a role for parties like the Green Party in British politics and in European politics. They're a growing force. And then we have other minority parties representing minorities. Now we see this everywhere. So we have the Scottish Nationalist Party, who are doing their best to rip Britain apart. Poor, pathetic, misguided people. But we see this everywhere, don't we? I mean, you talk about Syria, you have there is the Kurdish dream of independence. It's very similar to the Scottish dream of independence. You can't suppress it. You have to allow expression of these concepts. And if ultimately there is no other way, then let them go. Because what's the point? There's no point in getting wasting time with people who do not want to be with you. And what does it matter? It's irrelevant. get on with life and build a better future, and let them go. We should let, if the Scots persist in being obstreperous, let them go. If the Kurds in Syria persist in being obstreperous, let them go. That's my view, but the preference is for one united nation, because we don't want a more fragmented world. There's a move towards a more fragmented world. The Brexit vote, the anti-Europe vote in Britain was really an anti-establishment vote, and people were sick and tired of a establishment that had let them down over issues like banking. It's ironic, you know, when we see British politicians who are so grossly out of touch with the population, that you'll find them actually saying things like, oh, we'll lose jobs in the banking industry if we leave Europe. And most of the people in Britain don't care. They'd be glad to see the banking industry sacrificed, because they have seen their children's future squandered by profligate mismanagement by the banks in these years, this past decade. So where do we go? Britain tomorrow will be stronger because this woman, Theresa May, our Prime Minister, is tough and will be re-elected. There's an inevitability about that. It's not, there's not any question. But Corbyn will remain, in my view, the leader of the left, because despite the fact that he is despised and hated by many of the establishment Labour MPs who want to pretend that they are part of the right somehow. There's been this sort of false cloak that many establishment MPs, even from the left, have been wearing, where they don't want to rock the boat. And now they've got a leader who rocks the boat. So be it. They'll have to cope. I don't think Corbyn's going. Corbyn will remain after this coming election. The left, he will lose. He will lose substantially, but he will remain leader of the left, and because he's very popular on the left. He may not be popular enough to get into government, but that's not the issue in a way in Britain. Britain, we don't vote governments in, we vote governments out. If a government fails us, we vote them out. Theresa May and the Tories are doing well. There's, up to a point, a degree of economic resurgence in Britain. Employment, I mean, employment is at higher levels than it's ever been in modern times. That doesn't mean the salaries are very good. The wage levels are quite modest, but indeed they're scarcely keeping pace with inflation. But the actual employment, levels of employment are pretty solid. So people are not as angry as they might otherwise be with Madam Theresa May. She's not going to be voted out, and people are angry with the pro-Europe establishment who let them down prior to the coming of Theresa May as British Prime Minister. A non-elected Prime Minister, by the way. She was appointed by the Tory hierarchy, but now she'll face her election. No, she will be strengthened. She will be a strong Prime Minister. She will be tough, and it'll be very interesting to see how she handles the negotiations for Britain leaving Europe. But I think Europe needs Britain as much as Britain needs Europe, so that's not a major problem. And the European leaders bounce around full of pride about the issue, but Europe itself needs reform. It's good to see the new French president taking office. I hope Angela Merkel will not lose her position. She may. in the German elections. But it seems unlikely. The new French president is taking office. He will be very ultra pro-European, and Europe may get reformed by him and Germany, France and Germany in the lead. It's long overdue. Europe has been a failing project for too long. We need reformation in Europe, and perhaps they will bring it. So we've got a better future for Britain, better future for Europe without Britain, better future for the world, we hope. Let's see anyway. But British elections are coming up fast, and it'll be interesting to watch the outcome. Thank you. Okay, and we move to our third topic, the most esoteric of the three, you'd think, but it has a practical dimension. The question of tolerance. All the major religions of the world, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, most importantly, all the major religions of the world preach a doctrine of inclusivity and love, of tolerance for the other, of a world based on compassion, a world based on understanding of the other, a world in which we respect each other. And yet we live in a world that is divided, that is broken, that is so predicated on hatred and war and misunderstanding, in which we do not place an equal value on the migrant, on our enemies, on those who disagree with us. It is our God-given duty to respect one another. Tolerance. Now there's a word. Compassion for the other. I feel I'm like a preacher now talking to you, and I shouldn't. I want to share thoughts, not preach at you, because none of us are better than the other. We're all flawed, and I, as much as you, we all have our failings, each one of us. But there is a need for a society based on what? On compassion, on sincerity, on hope, and yes, and on tolerance. Tolerance, inclusivity is what we're talking about, including the other, placing an equal value on one another. We don't want to be regarded as any less than anybody else, and it is our right not to be regarded as of any less value than anybody else. So we should not, of course we should not regard anybody else as of less value than us. Basic human rights, you know this, and we all know this, and yet we have a tendency towards intolerance. We tend to be more comfortable with our own group and want the exclusivity of belonging to a group. And many people feel a lack of a sense of belonging, and that drives them towards intolerance. And we see this again and again and again in major international issues, most seminal of which is the issue of Daesh, ISIS, where you have a sense of inclusivity only for your own and exclude everybody else. And if you are not with us, you are against us. It's such a false road. And we need to watch for this disease in ourselves, because we're all subject to it. We're all subject to resentment of the other, resentment of the refugee that comes and takes our job, or resentment of the rich, or resentment of the minority who have a different view and dress differently and stick out like a sore thumb. And we have to be bigger than this kind of attitude. We actually have to watch ourselves and be compassionate about all, because we must care for the vulnerable in our society, the weak, the poor, and And we must not be resentful and angry about others that we feel are not part of our clique, our group. We need to include the stranger, not exclude the stranger. It's a simple mantra, it's a simple lesson, and it's one that all great religions preach. Islam, Christianity, Judaism at its best, Buddhism, whatever, they all teach a doctrine of inclusivity and tolerance of the other. Indeed, we have an extra special duty to the stranger in our midst, and we should particularly care for them. What's that old saying, you look after the stranger? It could be an angel. Of course they could be an angel. Everybody is of great value. So we want a tolerant society, and that actually extends towards societies coming out of war and conflict. Indeed, it extends towards societies in war and conflict. There is this tendency for establishment groups to treat troublesome minorities as pariahs. So they will say, the Houthis are all evil. What do you mean the Houthis are all evil? They're not all evil, they're people. Or the Shiites are all evil. What do you mean the Shiites are all evil? They're not, they're people. Or they will say, the Akhwan are all evil. They're not all evil, they are people. Now, whether they are misguided, the Houthis or the Muslim Brotherhood or any other group you choose to think is not your group, whether they're misguided is not the issue. They are still human beings with hopes and fears just like you and me. We all know this, but we have to guard against saying they are wrong as an entire group and we are right as an entire group. We have to fight this in ourselves. It's such an easy thing to do. To say, oh, the Alawites are wrong, or oh, the Druze are bad, or oh, whatever. You know, the Kurds are bad. You can't do this. You have to be. You have to base. You have to make sure, if anything, that you treat the other as more valuable than yourself. Have greater respect for the other. And then we can build a better world. And we are all equal, you know. I mean, all of us, women as well as men, by the way, stating the obvious, but it's one thing that doesn't need restating. There's an attitude, a male attitude, to place woman in second position. And that's inappropriate. Of course it's inappropriate. Everybody is equal in the eyes of God, certainly. And we are condemned in the eyes of God if we fail to recognize that, in my view. Then religion comes into this, of course. Tolstoy, I said this before, but Tolstoy, the great Russian thinker, said, there is no crueler thing than one man can say to another than, in terms of religion, then I am right and you are wrong. Nobody else is wrong. There is one God, and people will find their own approach and their own way to worship that God, and fine. Religious tolerance is as important, perhaps more important than anything else. Religious tolerance is one of the great four freedoms, as President Roosevelt of America used to talk about the four freedoms, and we've discussed these before on ANN. Freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. The four great freedoms at the basis, at the heart of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so freedom of religion is core, and that means tolerance. And in post-war situations, we need to be tolerant of those that have fought us. We need to be compassionate towards our enemies. The Prophet Muhammad was compassionate towards his enemies, compassionate in victory. And we need to be utterly tolerant. It actually needs to be a real mantra. And we have a situation now where we are hoping to see greater peace and stability in nations like Libya, like Syria. God grant peace in Yemen, I would hope. Terrible, terrible conflict with so many Yemeni children now starving because of the blockade on Yemen. No, we need peace. We need peace. And if we are, as I hope, moving towards peace in all these major seminal conflicts in the world today, then, and how many of them are in the Middle East? Why is this? I suppose because the Middle East is more important. Great powers are engaged in the Middle East and they like to meddle. But in any case, we are kind of moving towards a period of stability. And that means tolerance. That means the Palestinians have to be tolerant of the Israelis have to be tolerant of Hamas, and so forth. The Saudis have to be tolerant of the Houthis. We all have to be tolerant, especially if we're moving towards a more stable society. Tolerant of the other in our midst, tolerant of the stranger, and tolerant of those in disadvantaged situations who are dependent upon us, the refugee and the outcast. And tolerant too of those that make mistakes. We should even be compassionate towards criminals who have made gross errors and try and help reconciliation. There is no need for a society based on hatred, and it's a sick society when the society is based on hatred. So we should all reform ourselves. Change begins with yourself. Unless you change, you can't expect the other to change. You want to build a better society, change yourself. It's us that must be different, not the other. So thank you. I'm sorry if that sounded like preaching. It's just something I felt needed saying. You all know it. We all believe it. But I'm grateful to you for listening, at least. Thank you. Thank you for being our guest on ANN Television this time around. It's been good to be here. Thank you. So in conclusion, well, we always seem to have a conclusion on ANN Television when we do these programs. So we talked about Syria. Yes, and we need a more inclusive, a more stable society. People strive for and seek stability. People get tired of war, obviously. So what does that mean? Does that mean we back President Bashar al-Assad? Well, actually, there's no getting rid of President Bashar al-Assad at the moment. So we have to be realistic, don't we? We have to, otherwise, what's the point? Are we going to go on and on and on and on fighting? Now, is it the best way forward? It is the way forward. It's the only way forward. We've got now a resurgent Russia, which is dominating the Syrian scene, and with the support of Iran. And so there's no real question, I mean, of any other approach. We need to deal with the tools we have. President Bashar al-Assad is president of Syria. Finished. You're not going to change that. So shedding every last ounce of blood to change something that's unchangeable? Why? We need to build with what we have. The UK elections. UK has voted Brexit. You're not going to change that. Britain is leaving Europe. Theresa May will be a more powerful prime minister. We're not going to change that. It's interesting, the world is moving towards this position of having major power figures again. So fine. Live with it. We'll live with the independent Britain, with a powerful premier. We'll try and make the best of it and make a better future. And then tolerance. We finished up by speaking about tolerance. It is so important, whether you're in Britain looking at refugees coming in, or migrants, or people who have hope of a better future, or whether you're in Syria looking at a post-war situation and trying to be compassionate towards your enemy. Tolerance is what builds a new tomorrow, and it's what matters. Thank you again. God bless you.